Well, joining us now in the studio is international affairs analyst Dan Perry, the former Europe and Middle East editor of the Associated Press. And on Zoom, we have exiled Palestinian and peace activist Hamza Hawidi, who is joining us from Germany. Israel says that it's going to be using other United Nations and international agencies to ensure that aid reaches Gaza following major concerns from the international community that the absence of UNRWA is going to cause even worse of a humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. But are there any plans in place for this, and what do you think the impact is going to be?
I have not been convinced that Israel had a lot of forethought about how exactly it's going to deal with the services that need to be provided to the Palestinians in Gaza, where there has been a reliance on UNRWA and maybe an over-reliance on UNRWA. And you could argue that the entire edifice of UNRWA's existence in Gaza and the West Bank and other parts of the Middle East needs revision. But Israel did this in a manner that created a public relations disaster for itself at a time when most of the world is not looking at whether 19 out of 30,000 UNRWA members participated in Hamas activities, but whether there's a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And here's Israel basically taking out, or so it seems, the major global body that is in charge of this aid. So the complaints against UNRWA may be valid, sure. We could argue about that all day. And I tend to think, yes, UNRWA needs massive, massive revisions. But to take such blunt force and to pass a law that appears to be a banning of the organization that's primarily in charge of humanitarian aid to Gaza is such an own goal that I'm left staring in amazement. Mm-hmm. I mean, why they had to do this boggles the mind.
How essential do you think that UNRWA is to Palestinian society in Gaza? I mean, having grown up there, do you think that dismantling the organization is going to impact Gazans on the ground in a very bad way?
It's important to know that according to the UNRWA terms, more than 70% of Gaza's populations are considered refugees. For that, the UNRWA is responsible for them, whether that was with education, medical care, humanitarian aid, whatever. So yes, the UNRWA is very important to the Palestinian society, but it needs major reforms. And unfortunately, UNRWA was given more than 1 year to do these reforms, to declare those who are Hamas terrorists among the organization. Unfortunately, it did not. So I'd say that banning the UNRWA is a step that had to be taken, but the timing matters, because if the UNRWA is going to be banned today, who is going to deliver the humanitarian aid to the Gaza's population? There must be an alternative for UNRWA before banning it.
Yeah, Dan, go ahead.
Look, I see here basically two narratives. One says that the organization has like 30,000 people, and it's existing in a police state. The part of it that is in Gaza is still many, many thousands, and it's a police state. And if 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 or even 1% of them were somehow involved in Hamas, it's not shocking. Because realistically in Gaza, Hamas has so captured everything that there's almost no way around it.
Right,
and it's a little bit cheap to make such an... Well, but it may be inevitable is my point. There's another narrative. And I myself, having not been to Gaza in years now, I don't know which is true. The other narrative says, look, they're in bed with Hamas, end of story. They have sold their souls to Hamas in order to have access, in order to be allowed to function, and they know that Hamas is using their schools for munitions depots. They know that a teacher is holding hostages. They know that a number of them participate on October 7th because they're basically Hamasniks. UNRWA knows this and is putting up with it. Now, which of the two narratives is more true?
Hamza, do you have a response to that?
Yes, actually, I recommend you to go back to the UN archive for the UNRWA teachers' conversations on October the 7th to see their response, to see how they glorify terrorists. And the problem with those people is not that they are only 1% who does not affect anyone. Those were teachers teaching children at their schools, and the same teachers were terrorist supporters. So you can imagine they are growing generations adopting this ideology. It's not limited to 1 or 2%. They are influencing the remaining residents in the Strip. Not a coincidence to see many members of UNRWA as Hamas terrorists, or to see the warehouses of UNRWA controlled by Hamas. This is not a coincidence. There is a major problem with the UNRWA that should be resolved, reformed, or maybe replaced, but it has to be solved.
Right. All right. So, Dan, just final comments here. How can we expect the UN to react? I mean, could Israel lose its membership in the United Nations as a result of this?
I mean, in an extreme case, sure, but that's very, very unlikely. More likely are sanctions, which is a UNGA vote, resolutions condemning Israel, which is a UNGA vote. The Security Council could decide on sanctions. Israel could be kicked off committees and out of various UN organizations, maybe the World Health Organization. I'm not sure exactly the logistics in each case. But Israel could have limited access to Israeli citizens to work in various UN organizations. There's a lot of things that it can do to project that Israel's persona non grata. I frankly doubt any of that will happen other than a condemnation by the UN General Assembly, which seems likely. Let me just say this. It's clear that the UNRWA was too complicit in Hamas rule. We can be forgiving or not forgiving for what organizations do when they're dealing with the reality of rule by mafia. I don't know if any of us can judge sitting here in Tel Aviv, but clearly it's bad. Israel, if it wanted to take this move, should have had its story straight and its ducks in a row, and should have said, we're doing this, but it's not going to harm the Palestinians or exacerbate the humanitarian problem. We have a plan that involves the constituent UN organizations that UNRWA is essentially in some ways an umbrella of, and here's what we're going to do. And that should have been done at a very high level, like the foreign minister, prime minister. Instead, Israel again projects complete indifference to its appearance, to the appearance of events, and to its status in the world. And a country that is not completely, isolated and depends not just on exports, but on all kinds of collaboration, and wants to continue to be an associate member of the European Union, for example. This complete indifference to its status in the world is mind-boggling and reckless.
All right. Well, obviously, we're going to have to wait and see what the impact of essentially banning UNRWA from Israel and curtailing its ability to work in Gaza and the West Bank is going to have on local civilians. I'd like to thank you, Hamza, so much for joining us. Your first time with us. You will be back. I can promise you that. But we're going to be turning now to some more local issues. Things are not looking great for the Israeli economy as the war rages on. The finance ministry has slashed its growth outlook for this year and next year as a result of the ongoing fighting, which has worsened as a result of the escalation in Lebanon. The Treasury says it's now expecting the economy to expand by a mere 0.4% in 2024 and 4.3% in 2025. That is down from a September forecast, a forecast made just a month ago of 1.1% for 2024 and 4.6% for 2025. Well, joining us now is economy expert Alex Coman. So what does this mean for the average Israeli?
It's doom. It means that the average Israeli, you and I, we are going to pay for that. And the problem here is that Netanyahu and Smotrich, the Minister of Economics, for a long time they kept going with those demagogic statements, we are the strongest economy in the world. No, we are not the strongest economy in the world. We're an excellent economy. We're an excellent economy that is being bled by the ministry, first of all, by the war, which is an objective situation, but also by the ministry, by the Minister of Economics. He refuses to shut down wasted money on ridiculous, bogus ministries and things of the sort.
Look, you could say objectively this is a result of the war, all of it, the falling growth and the tremendously tragic situation with soldiers in rehab, which will be expensive. But if you take a step back, there's more to it than just that. The Israeli public generally doesn't take into account, unlike many other democracies, economic issues when it conducts its affairs, and indeed when people go to vote. Now, anyone with eyes in their head and a brain in their skull should have known that the things that the current coalition plans to do, including to perpetuate and increase the welfare state of the Haredim, which is very low participation rate in the economy, the overall welfare state, the huge sums poured into the settlements in West Bank, which are strategically a disaster for Israel, and all of it, a finance minister who dares to say that he thinks the economy should be run along the rules of the Torah. The minute this is the coalition that you sort of kind of elected, because the election was a tie, if you vote for these people, this is what you get. And it's incredibly immature. Now, as for the war, you could say maybe it is mature, that the economic impact is not being taken into account in a discourse about whether or not to prolong the war. Maybe that is mature, because the war is sort of a force majeure, perhaps. Maybe it's a deus ex machina. Maybe we can't not prolong it. But there is a decision being made to prolong it, and people should know. One of the consequences of that decision is zero economic growth, and by next year it'll be negative economic growth, which, by the way, in a country like Israel that has unusually high birth rates for the OECD, that translates into a collapse of the GDP per capita, which is the main data point.
All right. 20 seconds to respond to that. If there's any last words that you want to just say on that.
I can applaud for 20 seconds. Would that be okay?
Well, unfortunately, we have to go out for a commercial break. Is there any world in which Hamas will accept a temporary ceasefire right now, given the circumstances? Ariel, I'm interested to hear your take on this.
Well, they want to see a deal that will ensure the end of the war, because they don't want to give concessions that ultimately will lead to the end of their rule. That is their non-starter. On the part of Israel, the non-starter is the opposite. Israel wants Hamas to cease from existence militarily and in terms of their civil rule of Gaza. Now, as for the former, that's pretty much complete. Israel has managed to revoke Hamas from its military capabilities. It still is and will remain a guerrilla organization. Since the start of the war, they've managed to incorporate into their ranks thousands of new fighters, and all the fighters that Israel kills, they can bring in more. The issue is taking out the leadership, the military leadership. That has been completed. But again, we've said this for over a year, and we will continue to say this. In the absence of an alternative, this is also the reality regarding the debate on UNRWA. In the absence of an alternative, the current situation is what is expected to prevail moving forward in Gaza. At the end of the day, the question is, will the mediators find an equation that can appease both sides? At the moment, we're not there yet.
Dan, now that Sinwar is out of the picture, who is even calling the shots for Hamas at this point?
Well, no one knows. That's part of the issue. They have a council of sages now. I think 5 of them. Khalid Mashal may be one of the people. He's in Doha. But this raises a question about whether there's anyone to talk to have them refuse your offer. Ariel's right. The sine qua non for Hamas was that Israel ends the war and leaves Gaza. Now, this has been a blockage that no one has found a way to unblock. I can think of 2 things that they could do. One, decouple the idea of ending the war from leaving Gaza. I feel fairly certain in saying Israel will not leave Gaza and return Hamas to power. I myself have been flirting with trying to recommend such a path on the idea that you get back the hostages that are causing you to fight with one hand tied in a way, and then Hamas can be trusted to provoke you again, and then they go in and finish the job. Some version of that might be palatable to Israel, but even that has turned out to not be. So my conclusion is they're not going to pull out from Gaza and give Hamas, whatever's left of it, that victory narrative that they're back in power as if it was October 6th. So maybe decouple the 2 and say Israel's willing to declare an end to the war, but they're going to stay and figure out what next. It won't be Hamas. That might create pressure on Hamas, because the whole world is waiting for an end to the war. I've been calling on Qatar to pressure Hamas to just accept that the gig is up. But then they say, what next? If Israel were to go along with a narrative that returns a version of the Palestinian Authority, maybe under a different leadership, Mohammed Dahlan, maybe with whatever revisions and reforms are necessary, but something that looks like Palestinian self-rule, again, that would create a narrative that the world could work with to pressure Hamas and maybe to really put the squeeze on Hamas. If Israel was saying, yeah, we're going to end the war, and yeah, we'll work to create a new PA in Gaza, then there would be a chance that the U.S. and Egypt might pressure Qatar to basically force Hamas to do this, despite the fact that it would displease Iran.
So we're going to talk about why this isn't happening shortly. I'd like to just
politics.
Politics plays a huge role in this, and obviously, you know, there's new polls that have come out regarding what the Israeli public feels about this. What is Israel aiming to achieve with the continued fighting, especially given the fact that, Dan, you just mentioned there doesn't seem to be any post-war plan in sight that we know of?
It's reasonable for Israel to want to further eradicate and degrade Hamas. It's reasonable for Israel to hope that, despite what Ariel said, that the rank and file of the fighting force is constantly replenished, they will somehow create a situation where an Israeli pullout, leaving a vacuum, would not automatically mean a return to the status quo ante with Hamas in power. That may be what they're going for. But what appears to be the case is two other things that are depressingly political. Netanyahu seems prepared for a forever war. I don't think we can escape that because it's just obvious that he's in no hurry to end it. And there's an assumption that if the war truly ends, then the accounting over the political accounting over the debacle of October 7th, which was such a debacle that no politician should survive it, would finally arrive. And they're hoping to maximize the time between that accounting and the event itself.
All right, so I'd like to turn to those polls that I mentioned right before we watched this package. The most recent polls that have come out by Channel 12 News, which is one of the leading news sources here in Israel, show that 73% of Israelis want to see an immediate ceasefire and hostage release deal. So the question is, if that number is in fact reflective of the majority of the public, although obviously there are caveats here, why is the government not listening?
Because the government doesn't, that 73% does not represent the government. In the government, you have elements that have said, if Israel stops the war, the government will collapse. These aren't hints. This isn't political analysis. This was said by multiple coalition partners to Prime Minister Netanyahu. So
Could be a bluff.
It could be a bluff, but you have the Prime Minister who wants to continue to remain Prime Minister for all the reasons.
But think of what that theory means, Ariel. It means that in order to continue being Prime Minister, he's willing to have a lot of people die. Are you not shocked at the words that you're saying?
It's not just him. It's also the governing coalition.
You're suggesting he knows better. They don't. They prefer the war. That's clear. But he knows better, but is being blackmailed into continuing the war by the far right. This is the implication. And I'm not sure it's untrue. I do know, if true, it's shocking.
Look, I'm basing this on what we know, on hard facts, and the hard facts are that this is what the coalition partners are saying. Now, as for where the Israeli public stands, yes, the majority of Israelis want to see the hostages home now. That it goes without saying. What doesn't go without saying is what are the prices, the costs that Israeli public is willing to live with. We need to bring upon a deal now.
It's not unreasonable to assess that 73% just say we want the hostages back because they want to support the hostage families, right, and that's a zeitgeist. But if the actual real potential deal were put before them, are you in favor of releasing all the hostages in exchange for an end to the war and a pullout from Gaza and the giving to Hamas of a victory narrative, which is what has been their position and that hasn't changed? Are you in favor of that? I would assess from conversations the 73% support figure would fall to somewhere between 50 and 60.